Hello, and welcome to the pitch presentation for my Emergent project, MIDI implementation in Unreal Engine, especially using the new experimental plugin, the Harmonix plugin. Now, what we're going to go through today is the objective of my project and how I plan to achieve it. So, why I've picked this objective, my reasoning, what the industry is already doing in the sector I'm going to be tackling, how am I applying this technology? What am I implementing to make the project work? And then a more detailed overlook of what I plan to hit as we get to week 9 and the deadline. Now, my project was originally, at the very start, it was just going to be a simple project of connecting a MIDI keyboard to Unreal Engine. I assumed this project would be fairly complicated as I would need to learn MIDI event programming. I'd need to learn how to send events via ports and how to have Unreal Engine receive them. However, I realized quite quickly that Unreal Engine actually has a MIDI event to Unreal Engine plugin as native to the software. And so once I gave it a little try, I was able to get it working quite quickly and just have a character jump to the velocity that the player inputted the keys. It's pretty easy. So I had to look bigger, and I decided, okay, let's, instead of just making this technology work, let's see how we can implement it. So I'm going to create slash have been creating a piano simulation slash training software in Unreal Engine. It allows the player to play MIDI files in a rhythm game format, similar to your Guitar Heroes or one of my personal games up there, Everhood, where the notes are coming towards you and you have to react. This will be a great way to, get the player who wants to learn a bit more keyboard or maybe cement their skills, learn to get those skills properly while in a more enjoyable format than simply playing sheet music. Now, while this project started on being more on the training side of the simulation, actually teaching players chords and notes, I realized that if we look at the user base, if we look at my target audience for this project, most people who are going to buy it will already own a MIDI keyboard because that is an essential part of the experience. But if people are starting off first time, they may not have a MIDI keyboard to their name. So I've decided to pivot the project a little bit and focus more on the actual MIDI capabilities with Unreal Engine, implementing velocity and beats and bars, and trying to add a bit more polish so the rhythm gameplay is the big showcase. It will maybe be less of a target on people playing, like learning piano, and more of a target on taking those skills and applying them in a very fun and engaging game. Now, the thing is, MIDI implementation Unreal Engine, this isn't 100% new, but it is definitely a growing market. Now, Unreal Engine has actually started implementing more of a audio production side into their software with the new MetaSounds system and the new Harmonix plugin, which I will be using in this project. Sound designers and music producers have been going into MetaSounds and creating, whole new tracks to use in gameplay, but also just to create music. I mean, this YouTube video that you can see right here was about a man using the same MIDI event to Unreal Engine plugin I use for my keyboard, but to a much more bigger extent with all these different pad and knob events. Now, how is this emergent if it is just a growing market? Now, it may not be revolutionary. However, I consider this project to be emergent for accessibility, for us solo developers to create rhythm and MIDI functionality. And the reason I say that is because when I was doing my initial research, I kept finding these guys, AlgoSax. They're one of the only companies who have been bridging this gap between Unreal and MIDI. Now, the issue is, if you wish to create a rhythm game using their system, you have to be able to dish out a bit of money. you can see here that when I got the screenshot, it was on sale, but the original price of the MIDI engine rhythm tools is just under £200. Now, of course, solo developers can figure out, and I'm sure some have figure out their own unique way to create rhythm gameplay. However, that costs just as much in time, which solo developers probably do not have to create their own tools and C++ classes and everything. Um, and you'll see that because of this, there isn't actually a lot of rhythm games made with the Unreal Engine software. And if you do see those rhythm games, I'm telling you now, I've seen this AlgoSax system so much that I can immediately clock it as yes, they have paid the £200 to get that working. Now, this used to be one of the only ways you could do it with the AlgoSax plugin. However, now there's a new party involved, Harmonix. Harmonix is a company which specializes in music-based gameplay. Well, I suppose music and rhythm-based gameplay, right? One of their most recent games is a game called Fuser, which was actually made in Unreal Engine, and it allows players to sync different music tracks together. Syncing MIDI tracks is actually one of the core parts of Unreal Engine's Harmonix plugin. And because of that, it's very important that I am able to take these tools to create my own gameplay, right? To be able to take the techniques which this company uses and apply it for my own system. Now, the issue with that is it's experimental. This is in the most newest version of Unreal Engine 5.4. And so a lot of the times it looks like I'm staring at hieroglyphs because they don't comment their code, they don't give me any sort of tooltip to understand what, upchecked or a fine-tuned scent is. I just have to look at this and do my own research to understand what each of these are. And that's especially hard, seeming as a lot of the time, because it's their own tool and internally they know what these numbers mean, it's not the same as you would define it in the real world, in music theory. So it can be quite hard. But because of that, it does make it emergent. It's something that me and only a couple other developers are really experimenting with right now. In fact, one of the only documentation I could find on the plugin was a person tweeting about it. That's it. Now, how how have I been looking into the industry? What is my research? Well, I've actually had to do a lot of research into the music production industry as I've never played or learned an instrument in my life. I never had the time growing up due to my work, and it was one of the things. I could never play an instrument and I could never go scouts. So I'm completely coming from the ground up as a audio beginner. And of course, you might be thinking, if I don't know music, why did I pick a music project? And as I've said in this presentation, if I knew what I was doing, it wouldn't be as fun. So, where have I been coming from with my research? Well, I've been trying to look at it from a more human angle by asking the people around me. I sent messages to people on the staff's media mixer and talked to the people on the music courses about what they consider to be the most essential parts of piano learning and piano simulation. And this extends to the Emergent class themselves. I have to shout out Kat, who has been amazing for teaching me a lot of piano theory. And also, as you can see here, my software is not the only piano simulation software. And I have done a lot of research into how these piano simulators encourage players to get better and how they make the game, the tracks they play as easy to understand as possible. Now, let's go more into how MIDI actually works, because MIDI is the core piece of this project. I'm using MIDI events for my piano simulation game as it includes all the information that I need. Every MIDI event is made up of specific values. The event itself could be a note on, which means a key has been pressed, a note off, which means a key has been released, Or it could be more specific events. There are events called pitch bend, which is when the pitch of the note is changed. Or there are control events, which are used to target specific parts of music, such as if one part of a track has a higher tempo than another. But speaking of tracks, MIDI code is assembled into 7-bit packets. These packets are what essentially makes up a MIDI event. Now, they're assembled into tracks, and these tracks are just MIDI events are executed in parallel, so one after the other. And these tracks are then classified into channels. So if we have a look at this here, each of these could be its own track. So track 1, so and so, track 2, so and so. And then these tracks can be classified into channels. Now, specifically, I put here left hand and right hand because something I've learned in my research, which is quite cool, is that specifically piano MIDI events, because channels, which are usually used to denote what instrument the tracks represent, because it's only piano, there's only one instrument, they instead use it to tell the player or to tell the software what hand is pressing each key, right? Because you've got two hands to play piano. That's going to add another level of intuitiveness to my gameplay, as I can tell the player with the notes coming down, do you have to play with your left and right hand, which is going to teach the player proper technique. Now, looking even more technical, I started this project thinking I was going to have to make my own MIDI implementation plugin. I spoke about that at the beginning of this pitch. So I learned MIDI programming as MIDI low-level programming, and one of the main people I learned from, who was amazing, was a tutorial by JavidX9, which gave me not only like how to assemble machine code, but he also went through and diagrammed and made me understand what each line of code is doing and how MIDI events are read, how they're assembled. Something I learned from him, which I find quite cool about MIDI, is that it was actually made so long ago that the bytes are arranged in different way to modern byte arrangements. Bytes being, 8 bits. So we actually have to make a conversion of how the bits are assembled to be able to read MIDI files in the modern, way of reading. That's pretty cool. Now, this is programmed in C++, which means I could have spent time on it and popped it into Unreal Engine. Now, I have found the Harmonix plugin since this, but I still think this implementation I did, this practice, really helped in the development of my project, as it meant when I was dealing with the MIDI data from Harmonix, I was able to understand it better on a more detailed note. I was able to understand that when a note on event has a velocity of 0, it's actually considered a note off event. So on, just small little things like that. But it wasn't just from this tutorial that I learned all this. I've done my own independent research into lots of, MIDI databases and, documentation sites, the best of which being MIDI.org, which has documentation for loads of different MIDI systems. One of the, especially for low-level programming, what it has is how you assemble the bits and how that changes what the event it's representing is. Is it a note on? Is it aftertouch? Is it a control change? And so on and so forth. Having this core understanding of MIDI, even if I'm not creating the plugin itself, gives me the outlook and the knowledge to take the data I'm using and implement it in a better, more efficient way. And so I wouldn't, even though this took a couple weeks and isn't what I'm explicitly using, I wouldn't change it for the world. But what am I actually using right now? Well, I'm using the experimental Harmonix plugin. This Harmonix plugin allows you to import MIDI files into Unreal Engine. It does have a couple extra new actors, such as the step sequence, which allows you to simply create MIDI tracks. But I don't really need to use that for this. I'm not creating a way for the player to create their own MIDI tracks, simply to play MIDI tracks which are already implemented, if that makes sense. So that wasn't too big. But most of the harmonics nodes and most of its implementation is contained in meta sounds. As you can see here, just a second. As you can see here, we have the transport, which is pretty much the output which activates everything else, and a clock generator. Now, your MIDI clock is pretty much like a metronome. It's your indicator of what each beat should be at, the timing. So is it 1, 2, 3, 4, or is it 1, 2, 3, 4? That's why tempo, speed, and the signature numerator and denominator is so important. Is it a quarter event? Is it a 32 event? So on and so forth. And these are used to play the MIDI files in the MIDI stream. And the MIDI stream is just the collection of MIDI events, right? It's the collection of MIDI events played in the order that they are played. Now, in the blueprints itself, I'm mainly using implementation from Metasounds. So watching Metasound outputs and assigning blueprint events to these outputs. And what Harmonix does is it creates this new file type, get MIDI event info, and MIDI event info has a lot of interesting data, which I use in my rhythm gameplay. It has the note number, which tells me what key needs to spawn the note. It tells me what event it is. Do I have to stop a note or do I have to start it? Or is it a control change? Do I have to change the beats per minute or something like that? And this has even more applications. I plan to implement velocity, and I plan to implement, allowing the player to filter out different channels. So maybe they only want to play the track with their left hand. Okay, now let's quickly have a look at these two videos. Hello, this is a video to demonstrate the synth. Let me just get to a bit of me actual playing. Are corresponding to their game counterparts. Now, something else that you might be on notice is that if I press it softly, the key is quieter. I'll save you seeing me slam my keyboard, but that was a showcase of how the MIDI to Unreal plugin works. So how I was able to connect the MIDI keyboard, as you can see here, to its game counterpart. Synthesizing, a lot of that is done, well, in this original concept, this was done through a synth which I created. And then, do I go into the blueprints? No, I don't. But in the blueprints, I create my own MIDI input manager, which tracks the events which the MIDI keyboard is inputting into Unreal, and then just says, all right, it's this key here, so send event to this key that has been pressed, and play the sound. Hello. Now this is a video which showcases the actual rhythm. Give its feedback to the engine from a meta sound. Let me show you how this works. So this is a showcase of the MIDI, the harmonics nodes in meta sounds, which we've gone over a little bit. I will make sure to post the links to these videos underneath the forum post for the pitch, so you guys can see us for yourself, as this is a much more detailed showcase of how this system works. Altogether, alright. So, where was I when I first made this pitch? Because at this point where I'm recording this, I'm a little bit further along. But I had the MIDI keyboard area, I had the keyboard itself working, and I had the file playing. I had the MIDI files being played in Metasounds. And together, they come together to play MIDI tracks on a keyboard, which is where I'm at. Right now, it's week 8. I've just been finishing up development of my piano simulator. I didn't want to put the newest version on the pitch, as this is supposed to be a pitch document after all. But right now, I I'm kind of I've hit most things in my Moscow analysis, but a few things here have unfortunately been too complicated or just have lost the original vision. For example, in week 6, I wanted to create a tool which would allow players to load their own MIDI tracks. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to do this. File management in Unreal can be a bit annoying, and it's to the point where I wanted to focus more on the polish of the gameplay rather than adding something which really most players aren't going to be too fussed about. And that's the end of this pitch. Now, of course, you're not going to be able to ask me any questions, but thank you for watching.